December 26, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. For 8 days, American paratroopers were surrounded, starving, freezing, counting their last bullets. The Germans demanded surrender. The American commander replied, "Nuts," but they were hours from annihilation. Then, through the snow, they heard it. Tank treads. Was it German? No. That was a Sherman. Behind it, an entire army, 100 miles in 48 hours. At their head, General George S. Patton, Jr., and 100 miles away, Adolf Hitler received the message. Bastogne relieved. This is the story of the day George Patton made Hitler scream and shattered the myth that willpower alone could win war. The snow fell in silence, thick, relentless, covering the corpses and the craters alike. The air tasted of cordite and frozen breath. Inside the shattered stone cellars of Bastogne, American paratroopers crouched in darkness, their faces gaunt, their hands trembling not from fear, but from cold that had seeped into their bones. They had been surrounded for 8 days. 8 days without resupply. 8 days of German artillery that came in waves, each barrage closer than the last. The town square, once a place of Christmas markets and laughter, was now a graveyard of rubble and burnt-out half-racks. Above them, the clouds hung low and gray, thick as wool. No planes could fly. No supplies could drop. The men scraped frost from the Lunsky helmets to melt for water. They wrapped their feet in torn parachutes to stave off frostbite. They counted their ammunition, 1 clip, maybe 2, and knew that when it ran out, there would be nothing left but bayonets and fists. And then, through the muffled silence of falling snow, they heard it, a sound, distant, mechanical, rhythmic, tank treads on frozen earth. The sound grew louder. The men looked at each other, eyes wide, fingers tightening on empty rifles. Was it German? Was this the final assault? But then, someone heard the engines pitch. Someone recognized the growl. That wasn't a Panzer. That was a Sherman. And behind the Shermans came thousands of boots, moving fast, moving hard, moving through German lines like a spear through paper. They were not retreating. They were not digging in. They were attacking in winter, in snow, in the middle of the largest German counteroffensive of the war. They had come from over 100 miles away. They had come in 48 hours. And at their head, standing in the turret of a command tank, his face carved from stone and fury, was General George S. Patton, Jr. To understand the scream that would echo through the corridors of Adolf Hitler's headquarters 2 days later, one must first understand what Bastogne represented and what its relief shattered. In mid-December 1944, the war was supposed to be over. The Allies had liberated Paris. They had driven the Wehrmacht back across France. The Rhine was in sight. Berlin was next. The Nazi regime was on its knees, gasping, bleeding out. Every intelligence report, every captured document, every interrogation of prisoners said the same thing. Germany was finished. But Adolf Hitler did not believe in intelligence reports. He believed in will. He believed in the mythology of Germanic superiority, in the Wagnerian fantasy of Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, where heroes did not surrender, but burned the world down with them. And so, in the autumn of 1944, as his generals presented him with maps showing Allied divisions closing in from east and west, Hitler conceived a plan so audacious, so desperate, that even his most loyal commanders thought him mad. He would punch through the Ardennes forest, the same forest through which his panzers had torn in 1940, humiliating France, Britain, Belgium in a matter of weeks. He would split the Allied armies in two. He would recapture Antwerp, the critical supply port feeding the Allied advance. He would force the British and Americans to the negotiating table, buy time, to deploy his wonder weapons, the V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, the mythical superweapons that existed more in propaganda than in production. It was called Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Allies would call it the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, under cover of fog and snow, 3 German armies, 29 divisions, over 400,000 men, supported by 1,400 tanks and assault guns, smashed into the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes. Green units, exhausted veterans, cooks, and clerks found themselves facing SS Panzer divisions and elite Fallschirmjäger. The front collapsed. Entire regiments were encircled. Thousands surrendered. The Germans advanced 30 miles miles in 3 days, and at the center of this bulge, at the critical crossroads town that controlled 7 major roads, sat Bastogne. Hitler's timetable demanded Bastogne be taken in 2 days. Its capture was essential. Without those roads, German armor could not fan out, could not reach the Meuse River, could not drive to Antwerp. The 101st Airborne Division, hastily trucked in from reserve, dug into Bastogne's frozen earth. They were surrounded by 4 German divisions. They were outnumbered 5-1. They had no winter clothing, no heavy weapons, no anti-tank guns adequate to stop a panzer. On December 22nd, the German commander sent a delegation under white flag, demanding surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, read the ultimatum, thought for a moment, and replied with a single word: nuts. The message was delivered back to the Germans, who were baffled by the American slang. An American officer explained, "It means, go to hell." The siege tightened. German artillery pounded the town day and night. SS units probed the perimeter. Inside Bastogne, the wounded lay in churches without morphine. Surgeons operated by candlelight. The men ate snow. They burned furniture for warmth. They knew that if the Germans broke through, there would be no retreat. There would be only death or capture. And for the paratroopers who had been told stories of SS executions, capture was not an option. And at his headquarters in Luxembourg, 100 miles to the south, General George S. Patton stared at a map and made a promise. He would relieve Bastogne, not in a week, not when the weather cleared, now. To the men of the Third Army, George Patton was a contradiction incarnate. A cavalryman in an age of tanks, a warrior poet who quoted Roman historians and slapped shell-shocked soldiers, a man who wore ivory-handled revolvers and believed he had fought in past lives at Troy, at Cannae, at Crécy. His face was all hard angles, his voice a rasping bark, his profanity legendary. He believed in God, in reincarnation, in destiny. He believed war was man's highest calling. He believed in speed, in aggression, in hitting the enemy before the enemy knew he was there. And when his superior, General Omar Bradley, briefed him on the German offensive, Patton saw not disaster, but opportunity. "Brad," he said, "the Krauts have stuck their head in a meat grinder, and this time I've got hold of the handle." Bradley and Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower needed someone to break the German advance from the south, to smash into their flank, to relieve Bastogne before it fell. Eisenhower asked Patton when he could attack. Patton grinned. "December 22nd, he said. 48 hours from now." The room went silent. Patton's Third Army was 100 miles away, engaged in its own offensive toward the Saar. To disengage an entire army, 3 full divisions, over 130,000 men, thousands of tanks and trucks and artillery pieces, turn them 90 degrees north and drive them through winter storms over icy roads into the teeth of the German southern flank, was considered impossible by every standard of military logistics. Patton had already issued the orders. Before he walked into the briefing, before Eisenhower asked, Patton had anticipated the need. He had told his staff to prepare 3 contingency plans: 1 to attack northeast, 1 to attack north, 1 to attack northwest. Each plan was ready to execute on verbal command. All he needed was Ike's word. "When I get to Bastogne," Patton said, "I'm going to have a headline for the papers. Third Army advances 10 miles in blizzard, halts to allow Germans to catch up." On December 22nd, the Third Army turned north. The 4th Armored Division led the way, Sherman tanks grinding over frozen roads, slipping on ice, pushing through snow. Behind them came the infantry, feet wrapped in rags, rifles slung, marching through wind that cut like razors. They marched at night. They marched through German roadblocks. They did not stop. Patton drove up and down the column in his Jeep, standing upright, despite the cold, despite sniper fire, despite everything. When a column stalled, he was there, screaming at officers, directing traffic himself. When tanks ran out of fuel, he ordered supply trucks to the front. Damn the risks. When men collapsed from exhaustion, he told them to get up, to keep moving, because their brothers were dying in Bastogne, and every hour mattered. He prayed. Every night, Patton knelt and prayed. He had even commissioned his chaplain to write a special prayer for good weather, which he distributed to every man in the Third Army. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee, of thy great goodness, to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee that, armed with thy power, we may advance from victory to victory, and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies, and establish thy justice among men and nations. Amen." On December 23rd, The clouds broke. The sun came out. Allied fighter bombers swarmed into the sky, hammering German supply lines. C-47 transport planes dropped supplies into Bastogne. The paratroopers looked up and cheered, tears freezing on their cheeks. But they were still surrounded. The Germans were still attacking. And the 4th Armored Division was still fighting its way north, mile by bloody mile. Inside the Führer bunker in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler paced. He slept little. His hands trembled from the effects of the drugs his personal physician injected him with daily: methamphetamine, barbiturates, steroids, opiates, concoctions meant to sustain a body that was collapsing from within. His eyes were bloodshot. His skin was sallow. He screamed at his generals, blamed them for every failure, for every lost kilometer, for every delayed report. The offensive had stalled. His timetable, Antwerp in 2 weeks, was already shattered. Bastogne had not fallen. American resistance, which his intelligence officers promised would crumble, had instead hardened into fanatical defiance. And now his southern flank, the hinge on which the entire operation depended, was being attacked by Patton's Third Army. Patton, that name enraged him. The brash American cowboy who had slapped soldiers, who had raced across France faster than any panzer commander, who embodied everything Hitler despised about American culture, its lack of discipline, its vulgarity, its democratic chaos, and yet who won, again and again, with a speed and fury that matched the Blitzkrieg itself. On the night of December 25th, Christmas, Hitler's staff gathered in the map room. The reports were grim. The 4th Armored Division was 15 miles from Bastogne. German forces were retreating. American fighter bombers were destroying supply convoys. The weather had turned against them. Hitler's offensive had depended on fog and clouds to neutralize Allied power. Now the skies were clear. And then at 1650 hours on December 26th, the message came through. Bastogne relieved. American tanks have broken through. 101st Airborne no longer surrounded. What followed was witnessed by multiple officers and recorded in post-war interrogations and memoirs. Hitler's face went white. His jaw clenched. His entire body went rigid. And then he screamed. Not words at first, just a guttural roar of rage. A sound one officer described as like an animal caught in a trap. He swept his arm across the map table, sending papers and markers flying. He seized a telephone and hurled it against the wall. He shouted at his chief of staff, General Alfred Jodl, demanding to know how this had happened, how an entire American army had moved 100 miles in 2 days, how the roads had not been cut, how the Luftwaffe had not stopped them. Jodl, pale and shaking, tried to explain. The weather, the speed, the Allied air superiority. Hitler screamed over him. "Patton!" he roared. "Patton did this! That American gangster! That cowboy!" He ranted about American incompetence, about how the Americans had no military tradition, no warrior culture, how they were soft, how they worshipped money and jazz and Hollywood, how they could never match the discipline and will of the German soldier. And yet here they were, again, moving faster, hitting harder, doing the impossible. One officer, General Hasso von Manteuffel, later recounted, "I had seen the Führer angry before, but this was different. This was not the anger of a commander whose plan had failed. This was the anger of a man who realized, perhaps for the first time, that he had lost, that no amount of will, no mythology, no wonder weapons could change what was coming." Hitler ordered a counterattack. He demanded that Bastogne be retaken, that Patton's forces be encircled and destroyed. He sent in his reserves, the last of his elite SS Panzer divisions, the last of his fuel, the last of his ammunition. They attacked. They were slaughtered. American artillery, now resupplied, now coordinated, rained down on them. American tanks, now reinforced, counterattacked. The German offensive ground to a halt, then reversed. By mid-January, the bulge had been erased. The Germans had lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, thousands of trucks and guns. They had also lost something less tangible but more devastating, the myth that willpower alone could win wars, that ideology could overcome logistics, that faith in the Führer could substitute for food, fuel, and firepower. The men of the 101st Airborne, hollow-eyed and frostbitten, watched the Shermans roll into Bastogne's ruined square. Some cheered, some wept, some simply sat in the snow, too exhausted to stand. A lieutenant from the 4th Armored approached a paratrooper and said, grinning, "We came to rescue you." The paratrooper looked at him, looked at the tanks, looked at the smoldering ruins around them, and said, "Rescue? Hell, we didn't need rescuing, but you're welcome to join the fight." It was bravado, of course. They had needed rescuing. They had been hours, perhaps minutes, from being overrun, but the bravado mattered. It was the same bravado that had led McAuliffe to reply, "Nuts." The same bravado that had led Patton to promise the impossible and deliver. It was not ignorance. It was not recklessness. It was a kind of defiant optimism, a refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed certain. The Germans had studied American culture before the war. They had read reports on American softness, on the decadence of democracy, on the lack of martial spirit among a people obsessed with comfort and consumerism. They had believed that Americans, when faced with hardship, would break, that they would surrender, that they would negotiate. Bastogne proved them wrong. The paratroopers had been cold, starving, outnumbered, outgunned. They had every rational reason to surrender, and they had fought. And when Patton's tanks came, they had not come slowly, cautiously, waiting for ideal conditions. They had come through a blizzard, across 100 miles, in 48 hours. The contrast haunted German commanders. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander of the offensive, later wrote, "The speed with which Patton moved his army was the most astonishing achievement of the war. We'd calculated that it would take him at least a week. He did it in 2 days. That was when I knew we could not win." There is an object that recurs in the memories of German soldiers who fought in the Ardennes, an object so mundane that its significance is easy to miss: American ration tins. When German forces overran American positions in the first days of the offensive, they found supply dumps. They found warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with food: canned meat, chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, white bread, condensed milk. Many German soldiers had not seen such abundance in years. The Wehrmacht, by late 1944, was feeding its troops on ersatz bread made from sawdust and potatoes, on coffee brewed from acorns, on meat that was more often horse than beef. Soldiers supplemented their rations by foraging, by stealing from occupied populations, by eating whatever they could find. And here were the Americans, leaving behind tons of food, fresh food, good food. German soldiers stopped to eat. They looted American supply trucks. They filled their pockets with chocolate bars. Some units delayed their advance by hours, even a full day, because the men were too busy eating to keep moving. One German lieutenant, captured after the battle, was asked why his unit had not pressed their attack when they had the advantage. He replied bitterly, "We were too hungry. When we found the American supplies, the men refused to leave. They said they had not eaten real food in months. They said the Americans must have an entire continent behind them to waste food like this." It was not wastefulness. It was abundance. It was the product of an industrial base that had not been bombed, a transportation network that could ship fresh food across an ocean, a political system that believed soldiers fought better when they were well fed. The Germans had spent years being told that democracy made nations weak, that hardship built character, that suffering was noble, and here was the evidence that prosperity, not poverty, won wars. The ration tin became a symbol of the gap between ideology and reality, between what the Nazi propaganda machine promised and what the German soldier experienced. The Reich had told them they were supermen. The ration tin told them they were starving. George Patton stood in Bastogne's ruins on December 28th, 2 days after the relief. He walked among the wounded, the exhausted, the men who had held when holding seemed impossible. He did not give a speech. He simply shook hands, slapped shoulders, looked men in the eye and said, "You did it. You held." Later at his headquarters he wrote in his diary, "The relief of Bastogne is the most brilliant operation we have thus far performed. The speed of the movement and the violence of the attack were unprecedented." He did not mention the screaming in Hitler's bunker. He did not know about it yet. But he would have smiled if he had, because for Patton, war was personal. It was not abstract. It was not about maps and statistics. It was about will, yours against the enemy's. And at Bastogne, his will had broken theirs. Hitler had screamed because he understood in that moment what the relief of Bastogne meant. It meant that his last gamble had failed. It meant that the Americans, whom he had dismissed as weak, as incapable of sustained effort, as a mongrel nation without true warrior spirit, had outmaneuvered him, outfought him, and done it faster than his own vaunted Wehrmacht could respond. It meant that ideology could not stop tank treads, that propaganda could not fill empty fuel tanks, that screaming at maps did not change reality. The Battle of the Bulge ended in mid-January 1945. The Germans retreated back across the border, leaving behind their dead, their shattered tanks, their last reserves. The Allies pushed forward. The Rhine was crossed. Berlin fell. Hitler, in his bunker beneath the ruined capital, put a gun to his head. But the scream at Bastogne, that moment when fury and disbelief and the collapse of certainty all erupted at once, that scream echoed beyond Hitler's death. It echoed in the memoirs of German generals who tried, in the post-war years, to explain how they had lost. It echoed in the histories written by scholars who studied the Ardennes and asked, how did the Germans, with every advantage of surprise, terrain, and concentration of force, lose so decisively? The answer lies in the contrast between what the Germans expected and what they encountered. They expected the Americans to be slow, cautious, bureaucratic. They encountered Patton, who moved his entire army in 48 hours. They expected the 101st Airborne to surrender when surrounded. They encountered men who replied, nuts, and fought on. They expected their ideology, their belief in Germanic superiority, in the will to power, in the righteousness of their cause, to compensate for their lack of fuel, food, and firepower. They encountered reality. There is a photograph taken in Bastogne, January 1945. It shows a group of American soldiers, paratroopers, and tankers together, standing in the snow. Their uniforms are filthy. Their faces are gaunt. Some are smiling, some are not. In the background, the town is rubble. But they're standing. They did not break. They did not surrender. And behind them, stretching back 100 miles, are the tracks of Patton's tanks, tracks carved into frozen earth, proof that the impossible had been done. The photograph was published in American newspapers. It was seen by millions. It became one of the iconic images of the war, not because it showed victory, but because it showed resilience. It showed that when everything went wrong, when the enemy attacked with overwhelming force, when men were cold and starving and surrounded, they held. The Germans saw that photograph too. In prisoner of war camps, in occupied homes where radios whispered news of the front, in the bombed-out cities of the Reich, they saw it and understood. This was not the soft, decadent enemy they had been promised. This was something else. After the war, historians would analyze the Ardennes offensive from every angle: strategic, tactical, logistical. They would critique Hitler's decision-making, debate whether the offensive ever had a chance of success, examine the performance of units and commanders. The consensus would be that it was a desperate gamble, doomed from the start, a waste of men and materiel that only hastened Germany's collapse. But in the moment, in December 1944, it was not inevitable. Bastogne could have fallen. Patton could have been delayed. The weather could have stayed bad for another week. The 101st Airborne could have been overwhelmed before relief arrived. History is shaped by contingencies, by decisions made under pressure, by risks taken, by men who do not know the outcome but act anyway. Patton did not know he would reach Bastogne in 48 hours. He believed it was possible, and he drove his men to make it real. The paratroopers in Bastogne did not know they would be relieved. They believed it was possible, and they held. And Hitler, pacing in his bunker, screaming at his generals, throwing telephones, did not know he had lost. But in that scream, in that moment of uncontrolled rage, he revealed what he feared. That belief, no matter how fanatical, could not substitute for bread, for bullets, for the grinding, relentless power of a nation that could move armies 100 miles in 2 days and still have more tanks, more planes, more men coming behind them. The scream that echoed through the Führer bunker on December 26, 1944, was the sound of certainty dying. It was the sound of a man who had built an empire on the idea that will alone could reshape reality, who had conquered Europe through audacity and terror, confronting the limits of will, confronting the fact that his enemies did not lack will, they simply had more of everything else. Patton understood this. In his diary, he wrote, "Wars are not won by defensive tactics. They are won by guts and by speed. The Germans are good soldiers, but they have run out of gas. We have not." That was the difference. Not courage. Both sides had courage. Not discipline. Both sides had discipline. The difference was abundance. The difference was a nation, an ocean away, untouched by bombing, that could produce 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, 2 million trucks, and ship them across the world to men who, when surrounded, when cold, when starving, did not surrender. The Germans had expected to fight the Americans of their propaganda, weak, divided, obsessed with comfort. They encountered the Americans of reality, pragmatic, resourceful, capable of extraordinary ferocity when pushed. And that gap between expectation and reality broke them. Years later, when veterans of the 101st Airborne gathered, they would tell stories, not of tactics or strategy, but of small moments. The sound of Sherman engines through the snow, the taste of hot soup after 8 days of frozen K-Rations, the sight of Patton standing in his tank, grinning like a wolf. And when German veterans gathered, they told different stories. The ration tins, the American supplies, the endless columns of trucks and tanks, moving at night, moving in winter, moving when movement should have been impossible. Both sides remembered the same thing: the speed, the relentless, terrifying speed of the Third Army, crashing through German lines, breaking the siege, turning the tide. That speed was not just mechanical, it was psychological. It was the manifestation of a system, a democracy, for all its flaws, that empowered commanders to make decisions, that trusted soldiers to improvise, that valued flexibility over rigid doctrine. Patton could turn his army north because his staff had prepared contingency plans, because his logistics officers could adapt, because his soldiers believed in the mission. Hitler's scream was the sound of a totalitarian system, where one man made all decisions, where subordinates feared speaking truth, where ideology trumped logistics, colliding with a system that worked. In the end, Bastogne was a single battle in a war that lasted 6 years and killed over 60 million people. It was a footnote strategically. The Germans were already losing. The Ardennes offensive only accelerated the inevitable, but symbols matter. Bastogne became a symbol of resilience, of defiance, of the moment when the myth of invincibility died. And Patton's relief, the impossible drive through winter and snow and enemy fire, became a symbol of something else, of the power, not of one man, but of a system that could mobilize, adapt, and deliver. Hitler's scream, echoing through the cold stone corridors of his bunker, was the sound of a man realizing that symbols meant nothing, that all his speeches, all his pageantry, all his mythology could not stop George Patton's tanks. And in the frozen square of Bastogne, as American soldiers shared cigarettes and laughed in the weak winter sun, they did not think about symbols or systems or history. They thought about being alive, about being warm, eventually, about going home. They had done the impossible, not because they were supermen, but because they were ordinary men who, when everything went wrong, kept moving forward. That was the lesson the scream taught, that wars are not won by those who believe they cannot lose, but by those who, even when losing seems certain, refuse to stop. And that lesson, carved into the frozen earth of the Ardennes, would outlast every empire built on the myth of will. Epilogue. There is a graveyard in Belgium near Bastogne, where thousands of white crosses stand in perfect rows. American soldiers lie there, men who died in the snow and the cold, holding a town they had never heard of before December 1944. Visitors come from all over the world. They walk among the crosses. They ask, why did these men fight? What did they believe in? The answers are not simple. They fought for many reasons. For their country, for their comrades, because they were ordered to, because they were young and did not know how else to be. But beneath all those reasons was something else, a belief that their lives, their choices, mattered, that they were not cogs in a machine, but individuals whose actions could change outcomes. That belief, fragile, imperfect, often hypocritical, was what democracy offered. It was not a system that promised perfection or glory or purity. It was a system that promised a voice, a choice, a chance. And at Bastogne, that belief held, against the ideology of the master race, against the cult of the Führer, against the propaganda of inevitable victory. Ordinary men with voices and choices and chances stood in the snow and said, no. And when their general promised to relieve them in 48 hours, a promise that sounded like madness, they believed him, not because he was infallible, but because he was one of them, flawed, profane, mortal, and absolutely determined to keep his word. That was the difference. That was what Hitler's scream could not drown out. In the end, wars are not decided by the loudest voices or the grandest speeches. They are decided by men who, in the cold and the dark, keep moving forward, who do not know if they will win, but know they must try. And when they do win, the scream of tyrants fades into silence, but the sound of tank treads on frozen earth, the sound of relief, of hope, of impossible promises kept, that sound echoes forever.